Welcome, everyone, to this lunchtime seminar organized by the Birkbeck Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism. Um, I'm David Feldman, and I'm one of the co-directors of the Birkbeck Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism. It's a special pleasure to introduce today's speaker, who is an old friend of of the institute and was here um, um, undertaking her postdoctoral research. But today, Diana Popescu is a Gerda Henkel Fellow and also an honorary research fellow at Birkbeck in the University of London. She's the author of Revisiting Holocaust Representation in the Post-Witness Era, and the editor of several volumes, including most recently Public Engagement with Holocaust Memory Sites in Poland, published by Palgrave last year. Today, though, she's going to speak on her new project, or an aspect of her new project, and her title is A Jewish Refugee Artists in Prison, an untold story of visual resistance to fascism in the 1930s and 40s. Diana, I look forward to hearing you.
Thank you, David, and thank you to everyone who has joined us today. I'm delighted to be here with you online and to be able to share some insights that emerge directly from my current research project. Let me share the screen as I have prepared a PowerPoint presentation to support the talk today. And I hope this works. Yes. So just to say briefly where this paper is situated. So I'm sort of in the midst of a new research project that has the title of Visual Resistance: Tracing the Evolution of Perpetrator Images in Jewish Art from the 1930s to the Holocaust and its immediate aftermath. This project is funded by the Gerda Henkel Foundation in Germany. And one of the main outcomes of this research will be a book that is tentatively titled Facing Perpetrators in Jewish Visual Art Since the 1930s, Patterns, Ethics, and Reception. And as part of this broader undertaking, today's talk focuses on an underwritten chapter in the history of Jewish anti-Nazi opposition that emerged specifically in the 1930s and 1940s in the British context. And this story includes an eclectic group of Jewish refugee artists, as well as non-Jewish and British artists, illustrators, cartoonists, painters, graphic designers, who produced a striking and varied body of anti-fascist imagery. And among the names, the artists that I will be invoking today, we have here a list of them. So the more prominent artists would be Joseph Otto Flatter, Victor Weisz, Geza Zobel, Walter Trier, Stephen Roth, Fred Uhlman, Hugo Baruch, or Jack Bilbo, as that was sort of his anglicized name, as well as the more well-known John Heartfield and the British Jewish cartoonist Philip Zeck, which each of them in their own way waged what might be described as a one-man's wars against Hitler, against Nazism. Yes, I think it is still really crucial to embed their work and their activities within a broader anti-Nazi activism of artistic and cultural associations with which some of them were affiliated, most notably the British art collective Artists International Association, and the refugee cultural groups and organizations such as the Free German League of Culture, the Austrian Center, and the Czech Institute. So this talk will therefore aim to join the dots to examine how coordinated anti-fascist initiatives were and how central artists, particularly those of Jewish heritage, were to these efforts. And in this process, to write into this chapter the distinctly Jewish voices that shaped this visual discourse. So just a bit of a background, I suppose, to this talk, historical background. So London of the 1930s witnessed, as we know, a considerable influx of Jewish refugees fleeing Germany as early as 1933. In the case of artists, they tended to immigrate for three key main reasons. Firstly, they were Jewish artists, and like all Jews, they were discriminated against and harassed for racial reasons. Artists who were communist or anarchist or belonged to left-wing social democratic party were also persecuted as political opponents of the Nazi regime. And a third reason was that some artists were persecuted solely for the style of their works. And of course, there were artists who were persecuted for all these reasons. So between 1933 and 1939, refugee artists of Jewish descent arrived mainly from countries like Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, and with a smaller number coming from the Eastern Europe. The majority of them remained in Britain, or mostly they were resided in London, although some of them continued their journeys to the United States or elsewhere. So anti-fascism in visual art was, I believe, fundamentally a story of migration, as many artists active in the anti-Nazi satire, in the anti-Nazi satirical publications in Germany and Austria during the early 1930s tended to flee persecution by relocating to major centers in neighboring countries, and here most notably in France and in Czechoslovakia, so Paris and Prague. And we know that in Paris, for example, the Freier Künstlerbund became a significant hub for German-speaking exile artists, many working closely also with the French left-wing movements. In Prague as well, groups such as the Oskar Kokoschka Bund emerged there, as well as the exile presses that regularly published sharp anti-Nazi satire. So when these networks were threatened by occupation, several of these artists, with the help of the Artist Refugee Committee, which was a joint initiative of the Free German League of Culture with the Artist International Association, some of them were able to escape to Britain, where they tended to continue this visual resistance that they had kind of had already quite a history of on the European continent. So in Britain, the struggle against fascism became a shared denominator, uniting Jewish and non-Jewish refugee artists who worked alongside British anti-fascist art groups and individual artists, regardless of ideological differences, though left-wing and communist convictions were especially strong within artists that belonged to the Artist International Association and the German League. Before 1939, refugees were, or artists in particular, were discouraged from public political expressions. So anti-Nazi sentiment tended to circulate discreetly, privately within these cultural and social associations. Yet after this sort of changes after the outbreak of the war. And many of the artists of this period were interned as enemy aliens in Hutchinson camp on the Isle of Man. However, some of them were quite quickly released, and there was a joke going on at the time that artists were sort of moving from the IOM to the MOI, from the that is from the Isle of Man to the Ministry of Information, which sort of captured the rapid turn, sort of the way in which quite a lot of the artists took on posts at the Ministry of Information. So throughout the 30s and the 40s, we see anti-Nazi cartoons appearing in mainstream, mostly left-wing British press. We see artists like Otto Flatter, Walter Trier, John Heartfield, Victor Weisz, also known as Vicky, contributing to various newspapers, including the Evening Standard, the Daily Mirror, the News Chronicle, as well as Reynolds News, and magazines such as Lilliput or Picture Post. And they worked alongside more accomplished, more well-known British figures like David Lowe, as well as the British Jewish cartoonist Philip Zek. Anti-fascist publishers also, such as Lindsay Drummond and Victor Golan, frequently commissioned refugee illustrators. For example, Heartfield was one of them. And another platform where sort of this anti-Nazi visual discourse was presented is the Exile Press as well, and an essential platform is the Zeitung, which was described as the only free independent German daily newspaper in Europe. And this featured work by Walter Trier, by Richard Ziegler, Ludwig Meindl as well. So alongside these, the press, refugee cultural organizations also played a crucial role in disseminating anti-fascist work produced by Jewish refugee artists. So in what follows, I want to introduce some of these organizations and some key exhibitions highlighting how Jewish voices shaped the visual language of anti-Nazi resistance. And I will start with the Artists International Association, which was founded in 1933, and it became one of Britain's most politically engaged artistic collectives. Founding members of this association were Misha Black and Pearl Binder, who were both of Jewish heritage. They were sort of working affiliated with socialist-leaning British artists, including Cliff Rowe, James Fitton, and James Boswell, just to name a few. Generally, these were a group of disenchanted young artists that found themselves struggling to initiate a career. And they were kind of united by their socialist Marxist convictions. Some of them having spent time in the Soviet Union, such as, for instance, Pearl Binder herself. And the organization itself tended to treat visual art as a political instrument. They called it a demonstration. So a weapon, a political weapon in the defense of democracy, and they tended to produce a wide range of visual material, ranging from posters, illustrations, cartoons, and many exhibitions. So its mission is clearly defined as, I quote, unity of artists against fascism, war, and the suppression of culture. And this mission opened the organization to collaborations with many Jewish emigre artists fleeing Nazi persecution, as well as it helped them gain support from major British figures in the art world, like Paul Nash, Laura Knight, Henry Moore, Barbara Hepford, as well as the influential art critic Herbert Reed. And so this has to do with the way that they sort of moved away from the original sort of Marxist beginnings, and kind of portrayed themselves, in fact, as a sort of as an open organization that was open to artists of various ideological convictions, styles, and belonging to various art movements as well, that were all united by this attempt to preserve democracy and to fight against, therefore, fight against fascism. So between 1933 and 1945, it developed a series of exhibitions. And through these exhibitions, it also provided platforms for refugee artists to show work, to rebuild careers, to garner financial funding, really, to support the persecuted groups. So one striking example that I wanted to share is from an exhibition of theirs that was put together in 1942 at the Charing Cross Underground. And sorry, just to kind of introduce you to what you see on the slides. So we see here images of members of the group involved in sort of actively putting together murals, and they were sort of convening in congresses. And the left image there, you see Misha Black alongside other members of the organization. Um, um, Let us move on. So this is a series of the sort of they've developed a wide range of exhibitions, generally quite a few every year. What is interesting here is that the well-known exhibition, the 20th century German art, that was shown at Burlington galleries. This was in 1938 as a direct response to the degenerate art exhibition, um, um, and happening sort of in Germany, displaying artists that were persecuted because of their art. So what the Aya did was sort of use this exhibition as a platform to garner support for Spain. And you see there a leaflet that they put together, announcing that Hitler attacks this exhibition, therefore sees it as sort of as dangerous, and so they are part of this conversation from the very beginning, even though this exhibition hadn't been put together by them. They are very much endorsing this movement in the art world, which is to stand strongly against fascism. So now I want to kind of return to the example that I wanted to talk about. So this was an exhibition from 1942, which incredibly featured a refugee artist of Hungarian background, Geza Zobel, who who was persecuted sort of in Europe. He had emigrated to Paris, where he served with the Free Czech forces, and once he sort of escaped to Britain. In London, he started producing a series of 41 drawings that were inspired by Goya's disasters of war, which were based on his own on what he had seen, on his own experiences, as well as testimonies of torture and the reports of the persecution of Jews in occupied Europe. So, just as a sort of background to this, the art critic Herbert Reed had discovered these drawings, and sort of with his help and also the support of the Czechoslovak Institute, there was an exhibition that displayed his works. Later on, they were also shown at the Victoria and Albert Museum, and then were published by Penguin Books in 1942 as part of a publication that you see here in this photo. And I've just put together a few of the more striking imageries that Sobel sort of produced around this time, um, which are very confronting, really confronting images of the pain, of the torture, of the persecution of Jews in Eastern Europe. We have there an initial image of depicting Lublin, Europe's ghetto. We have an example of a scene of Jewish procession, as well as depicting persecution in collaborating countries like Romania, with the subtitle "The Contagion Spreads." So these are very unlike the material that was produced in the press, which tended to focus um, on the major figures of the Nazi regime, on Hitler, on Goering, and so on. This turns sort of another. It's a completely different way of introducing the subject to British audiences, and to the sort of the broader refugee group at the time. And it's obviously a direct response to what's happening in the occupied territories in the East. Um, and uh, this type of material didn't necessarily wasn't viewed at the time as serving as testimony on its own. And I just want to kind of bring in a quote from Jan Straski, who was the assistant to the Czech prime minister in exile in Britain, and he sort of explains what the aim of this imagery was. And in the introduction, um, it states the object of these drawings is not to make you shudder with horror. Their object is to make you clench your fists and hit back. All of us pursued the easier path when we refused to see, but all that we would not believe has come true. Something unspeakably evil has come upon us. So it's very much sort of within the discourse of mobilizing support for the war. Um, Now, moving on, another of Aya's most ambitious projects, possibly most ambitious projects, was the landmark exhibition For Liberty from 1943, which was held at the bomb-damaged John Lewis building on Oxford Street. It was supported by News Chronicle and the Ministry of Information, and you've got here a few images of this exhibition, which was mainly dealing with three key themes, which were how we are fighting, what we are fighting for, and what we are fighting against. So the sort of the visuals of the exhibition had been put together by a German Jewish designer, F.H.K. Henrion, and sort of working with the four freedoms, the emblems of. He had put together this sort of the emblems of the four freedoms, which is sort of freedom of speech, freedom to worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. And sort of summing up the vision for the future that the members of this organization had, and their position as a stronghold for civilization, for democracy. So the exhibition itself featured 150 works by various artists, including refugee artists. And I wanted to highlight two of these works, which one of them was Oskar Kokoschka's painting titled "What We Are Fighting For." Kokoschka had been a major figure in the German League, and as well as collaborating intensively with the Aya. His position was very much that of a fighting sort of Nazism through a humanist lens. So he wasn't he didn't belong to the sort of the left-leaning groups necessarily. Yet he was extremely central to linking these organizations together, and sort of, yes, sort of this image speaks for itself. We've got there in the middle the image of a crucified individual there, the crucifixion, and it is branded with the PJ, that is Parish Judea. So it's a very sort of emotional rendering of Kokoschka's sort of a position towards the horrors happening in Europe. Another notable contribution, a part of the For Liberty exhibition, was Maurice Kestelman's painting Lama Sabatani from 1933, which was one of the earliest British artistic responses to the Holocaust, and I think it was a notable, notably very prominent in the exhibition. So the exhibition was one of the, as I said, one of the most successful exhibitions. With about 36,000 visitors visiting, seeing the exhibition then. So generally from the 1930s to onwards, the AYA worked really closely with other organizations, and I have mentioned the Free German League of Culture. They were sharing political aims and overlapping memberships. Many refugees belonged to these organizations as well as to the Austrian Center. So the German League was founded in 1938 in the Hampstead home of German Jewish painter Fred Uhlman, and it became a major cultural hub for refugee artists. It had around 100 artists in its fine arts section, and it developed strong political connections as well with the British mainstream politics through Uhlman's wife, Diana Croft, who and also worked closely with the AYA to provide platforms for refugee artists. So not all the members that joined the Free League were Jewish. However, they were strongly united, and they described themselves as an organization of refugees, anti-Nazis, and anti-fascists. And it's one of its most influential shows was sorry, I'll come back to that. But yes, among one of these earliest exhibitions actually was that of John Heartfield in 1939. This was advertised as a one-man exhibition. In fact, it was called One Man's War Against Hitler. And it brought together photo montages made by Heartfield in Berlin and Prague. However, in the context of this exhibition, they were slightly toned down. Some of them were considered too aggressive for British audiences at the time. So here are a few examples of the type of imagery that Heartfield was very well known for. So this was an exhibition in 1939, followed by one of their most perhaps influential shows, which was Allies Inside Germany from 1942, displayed in an empty shop in Regent Street, and later it toured nationally. And it was aimed really as a demonstration of anti-Nazi resistance happening within Germany itself. It was supported by the Ministry of Information, and it had attracted around 30,000 visitors, and it had extensive press coverage at the time. Moving on, in February 1943, they put together with the Austrian Center and the Jewish Cultural Club the exhibition Artist Aids Jewry. This was at the Whitechapel Art Gallery with about 30,000 visitors, so much more low-key than the previous one. Most of the artists were Jewish, persecuted for being Jewish. And the exhibition itself also included very powerful works representing the refugee plight. And here I have an example from Eric Kahn and from Arnold Bishop. So moving on, a third major organization that provided a platform for anti-Jewish for anti-Nazi representations was the Austrian Center. So it was the sort of the Austrian Center was part of the Free Austrian movement, which was founded in 1941, and it became the largest umbrella organization for Austrian exile groups. Its most important cultural organization was the Austrian Center, and it operated an extensive network. It running three London venues in Paddington, Swiss Cottage, and Finsbury Park, and it was Sigmund Freud was its honorary president. And as part of the Austrian Center's art section called the Association of Austrian Painters, Sculptors, and Architects, this was founded by Oskar Kokoschka and was presided by sculptor Georg Ehrlich. And like the German League, the Austrian Center opposed what they called Nazi barbarity, and it focused on upholding Austria's national identity, so positioning itself as a major representative of a country raised from the European map. And among its most notable exhibitions was a one-man show again of Austrian Jewish refugee Joseph Otto Flatter, and sort of his work is really wide-ranging, and we've got here a few examples of the type of drawings that he developed. So they were sort of commonly known as Mein Kampf Illustrated because many of them were a direct response or provided a critical reading of Mein Kampf, and most of them focused on Hitler as sort of as the main protagonist of National Socialism. So Otto Flatter had other exhibitions that he presented prior to the one at the held at the Austrian Center, and so among the first ones from April 1941 was an exhibition called The Life of Hitler, which according to a contemporary reviewer, it consisted of, quote, vivid accounts of actual events on the unhappy continent and such striking pictures of the chief tyrant and his accomplices. But not only that, I want to also emphasize, aside from his portrayals of Hitler and in contrast to other visual representations of him, he comes across as a sort of pitiable, diminished figure. So sort of the drawings themselves undermine his aura of authority. But was it also important is the way that Otto Flatter was directly addressing the sort of the Jewish aspect of this story, the persecution of Jews, sort of as being central to Mein Kampf, to this ideology. And here we've got a few images. Moving on, it's not just Hitler that is being presented, or the sort of the Nazi leaders, but also the typical German soldier who, as we see here, we've got images representing, in fact, what lies underneath National Socialism, which is hatred, death, famine, and very many very many visual representations bring in these metaphors of what lies underneath, which is this destructive force of the regime. Yes, here sort of Hitler is a kind of a diminished figure. And we've got here again a representation coupled with a quote from Mein Kampf. But also, Flatter also included much stronger commentary on the persecutions themselves, and this is a very striking image of the concentration camp, as well as this particular one, which is in direct reference to the to genocide. So to mention another thing to mention about Otto Flatter is that he joined the Ministry of Information, and which commissioned some of his work, and caricature at that time was considered a powerful weapon of instruction and persuasion, and the British government was very involved in producing such work, with millions of leaflets being dropped over Europe as part of the psychological warfare strategy. And not only Flatter, but also others were very involved with this type of work. And I've got here an example from German Jewish artist Walter Trier's series called this is called Nazi Germany in 22 Lessons. So it was a series of leaflets produced that were dropped by aircraft over occupied Europe. And we see here that the aim is really to kind of dismantle the Nazi propaganda through humor, through irony, and the leaflets itself are made of sort of 22 lessons, each exposing a real meaning of propaganda and of the language itself that was used at the time. So, see lesson one. What does lesson one mean? This peace offer, which shows this dove carrying a bomb instead of an olive branch. So, sort of underlining the regime's perversion of sort of a symbolism of peace, what it means. And there are various other examples like this. The sort of the final lesson there, the Nazi New Order, which sort of depicts this executioner resembling a Ku Klux figure, which is sort of responsible for the death and persecution of women and children. You've got images of this of destruction in the background, as well as the sort of the concentration camps. Aside from Walter Trier, other notable figures were Richard Ziegler. His series of drawings that were put together in the publication called We Make History. So this book specifically pairs caricatures of Hitler, Göring, Goebbels, and others with quotations from Nazi sources, sharpening the contrast between the sort of propaganda, National Socialist propaganda, and the lived reality yes, you've got here an image of Hermann with Göring with quotes that were allegedly belonging to him. So these confrontations cut through Nazi euphemistic language and laying bare the gulf between the regime's self-representation and the brutality of its actions. Ziegler also inserts imagery of the victims of the regime, so not all of it is focused on the figures of the perpetrators. In this case here, we have an example from early on of the murder of Theodor Lessing, and this is Ziegler's own voice, and sort of remembering what had happened to him, alongside a quote from Nazi propaganda. There. So it's sort of quite provoking the way that this is being put together as as a way to kind of to raise up a form of reaction from the public. Um, And yes, we've got here another image as to what barbarism meant in sort of reality. And again, the Nazi regime is very much, very frequently described as barbaric, as savage, as uncivilized, a regression of civilization. So this is the sort of language that is being used in the press. And here we've got a juxtaposition of what, in fact, barbarism means in contrast to Hitler's. Without the German nation, there would be barbarism. Another example that I don't have time to kind of go through, but there were a series of publications of Stephen Roth, of Jewish Czech background, that are more of a conventional political commentary, satirical commentary on the evolution of the war and the sort of the the National Socialist regime, as engaged in the war, in the Second World War, and less on sort of the persecuted groups themselves. But it is a noteworthy example. And here we have a cartoon by Philip Zeck called "Strength Through Joy." So Philip Zeck developed a really fierce anti-Nazi stance well before the war. This was shaped, as noted by his brother Donald Zeck, in direct response to witnessing the escalating violence against Jews in Germany. And in this particular image, it's sort of described by Donald Zeck as, quote, "the sheer ferocity of the cartoon defined Zeck technique of the future. This was not so much drawn as unleashed." And we see here the figure of a German soldier stomping over a war-shattered landscape, a grotesque figure with hairy hands and large subhuman features, embodying everything Zeck despised about the Nazi war machine. And generally, Zeck's broader visual strategy was to present leaders, the Nazi apparatus, using animalistic features, as well as the symbols of death that sort of underlines these the regime itself. And interestingly, Zeck and others, I would argue, rejected this label of propaganda, arguing that this diminished its artistic agency, that his work today, I think, could be described more accurately as political activism, yet he had insisted that he was an artist first, motivated by humanitarian conviction, and I quote, "a deep-rooted detestation of Hitlerism in all its forms." As he put it, if in the process his works emerged as effective propaganda and helped the war effort, that was fine for me.
Are you able to draw to a conclusion, Diana, so we have some time
Yes.
for questions and
Yes.
discussion? That would be great. Thank you.
Yes, I am heading there. So this is one final example that I wanted to share, was the initiative of a German Jewish refugee artist, Jack Hugo Baruch, or Jack Bilbo, who had opened a modern art gallery in London at the time, and to provide this platform for artists to present their work, but also he very much saw this as a platform, as part of a necessity, I call, believing in a necessity for an intellectual fight against Hitlerism and all it stands for. And one of the exhibitions that was shown there by Victor Weisz Vicky, called Anti-Fascist Exhibition by Vicky. So I could see from these various examples, there were sort of numerous ways in which the sort of a collective body of anti-Nazi resistance was being shaped visually. So just to sort of final remarks and then I will conclude. So through the interconnected networks of refugee organizations, the consistency through which the efforts and the series of exhibitions that gave voice and platforms to Jewish artists of different backgrounds. We see here the coming together of a visible anti-Nazi stance that took place within this context of exile in Britain. So the artist found presented here, but also other artists found support within these networks, and particularly the AYA, which legitimized their efforts, even though in internal papers that I have looked at, they rarely single out Jewish persecution explicitly as the primary driver of their anti-fascist work. Instead, there was a shared anti-Nazi discourse that emphasized the fight for civilization, for democracy, freedom of thought and expression, values that undoubtedly connected all these groups. So within this shared framework, artists collectively sought to undermine the power of the Nazi regime by exposing its brutality, inhumanity, and the profound weakness underlying its claims. And as sort of this is put quite straightforwardly by Philip Zeg himself, when he states, the objective was simple, straightforward. We had an enemy. The enemy had to be defeated. All one had to do was to keep up the morale, keep the troops happy, and make sure we won the war. So although artists of Jewish background formed the majority within the German League and other related groups, their shared anti-fascist outlook was not overtly expressed in specifically Jewish terms, nor was it foregrounded necessarily in the public discourse. And this lack of explicit visibility may reflect several possibilities, and this is sort of an area that needs to be further investigated. It could have been a strategic compromise intended to preserve the unity of this internationalist solidarity that went beyond Britain to United States, for example, which was made of a diverse coalition of artists and that were committed to a shared anti-fascist cause, as well as the general vulnerability of the refugee artists and the fact that their political activity had been discouraged, prohibited before the Second World War. And as well as I should add a sort of a rejection of Nazi racial definitions of Jewishness, as many of the artists presented here were regarded themselves as patriots, as true Germans, Austrians, Czechs, and so their Jewishness remained somewhat private. And across the Atlantic in the United States, comparable organizations existed, and Jewish emigre artists like Eric Schleifer or William Sharp, Eric Godal or Arthur Schick made extraordinary contributions through the work that they did for the various newspapers in the United States. So connecting these stories of Nazi opposition in art, I think it is, for me, I regard it as sort of an unwritten chapter. And the sort of imagery is developing really a collective visual language, if we are to look at it as as a corpus, as a coherent corpus of work, which exposed Nazism as inhuman and unmasked its ideology as destructive. And later in the work of Holocaust survivors that used visual representation after the liberation of the camps, I think we see the next stage of this visual testimony, which is much more explicit, more direct, bearing witness to the full extent of the Nazi crimes. And the refugee artists' work, I think, that I presented today form an important foundation for this later and more overtly testimonial visual culture. And I've sort of ended this with a picture of from Walter Trier, who in 1946 put together this cartoon, but my pen has outlasted them, which is very much mirroring, I think, sort of a wider perception among this group of artists. So I will end there. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Diana. Uh, we have just a little time for questions. We already have two people with their virtual hands raised. If you do have a question or a comment, three people, if you have a question or a comment that you'd like to make, please do raise your virtual hand. We'll take them a few at a time because time is short. If you could be try to be brief with your question or your comment, and Diana, if you could try to be concise in your answers, then we'll get through everyone or as many as possible of the people who have something to say. So we'll start with a group of three. First of all, Vanda Grace Lawrence, and then Dee, and then Rachel Dickens, and then Rachel Dixon. Vanda.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah,
absolutely.
it was absolutely fascinating and very, very timely. I just want to say my interest is more lit in literature, but at the moment I'm reading a lot of Brecht, which I would like to direct one of his plays. But what has really shocked me recently, I've been reading Fear and Misery in the Third Reich, is how appropriate, I'm afraid, it is to what is happening now. Because it's very much about how within the society in Germany, the kind of cruelty, the brutality was becoming normalized. And anyone who opposed it was considered the enemy. And so it's very frightening because it's quite nuanced in a way in its brutality. So I just want to say I'm very thank you for this lecture, and it's horrible that I feel we're in a very I find quite alarming time. That's it.
Thank you, Vanda. Dee.
Hi, thank you very much, Diana. I am doing post, I'm doing a doctoral research, part of my research into first generation survivor Holocaust, but in Europe, not in the UK. And I was quite surprised to see your content. Could you speak a little by your findings of the difference by way of extremism, if you like, honesty, which is in my research, it's that the Europeans couldn't express, as opposed to the British Jewish artists who were very expressive about their political activism. Are you aware of what was going on elsewhere in the world?
Thank you, Rachel.
Specifically Europe, I think.
Yes, thank you very much for that. Do you mean in the 1930s and the 40s specifically?
Exactly.
Yes.
Your
Yeah.
period, yeah.
Yes. Well,
If you
quite
just
a
hold
few.
on before you answer,
Yeah, I will
Diana,
do.
we'll just take Rachel
Okay, thank you,
now.
Diana. Um, I'm from the Ben-Uri Gallery, which I really wondered whether you were familiar with, because a number of the artists that you spoke about are represented in the collection. And although their works might not be from the 30s, they're certainly sort of key artists within Ben-Uri's collection. And then in 1946, Ben-Uri had an exhibition on subjects of Jewish interest, which included artists like Ludwig Meidner and Felix Topolsky, who were then illustrating, as you mentioned, the subjects of the camps. But certainly you can trace the earlier representation of a number of the artists you mentioned within Ben-Hur and subsequently in the collection. I also wanted just to show you the Matuszewski painting that was, can you see that? Oh, it's not really in focus. Or, oh, it's chosen to focus on one of the nude figure. Sorry, it doesn't come out more clearly. But my third point was clearly the AIA is having a moment, and Monica presented very recently a talk given by Andy Friend, who has just published recently Comrades in Art, Artists Against Fascism, 1933 to 43, which focuses on the AIA and is accompanied by the most fantastic archival display at the Marie-Louise von Matuszewski Archive Gallery at Tate.
Thank you, Rachel. Diana, would you like to respond briefly to those?
Yes, just to sort of to start with Rachel. Yes, I'm very much aware of Andy Friend's study, and yes, I have also seen the exhibition as well. There's if it's still on at the Tate, I strongly encourage you to look at it. It sort of follows the history of the Aya from the first decade of it, which is sort of a very tumultuous time for them. And indeed, I was sort of struck by the fact that I was looking at, reading through, and I was simply struck by the fact that these artists are not named as sort of having a Jewish heritage, which really is something that I'm still sort of intrigued by that, and I think part of my efforts are to bring back the Jewish origins, sort of something that had motivated them to be so strongly and fiercely engaged with it. And I'm still looking at material that kind of strongly suggests that this was a central motivation, and not much has been written down. That's why sort of invoking Philip Zeg's and actually his brother's, comments and bringing in his legacy is interesting. But yes, I have been to, I've sort of, on my visits, my archival visits, I have come to you to Ben-Hur Gallery, and I suppose I haven't mentioned Ben-Hur in this talk as something that, I think I should include, although I see it more as offering a platform for Jewish voices that is not specifically political. They didn't, sort of from the material that I looked at, they hadn't really taken that more strong political position as compared to the AIA in London. But of course, it was a sort of a very broad network of different associations and groups that had communicated among each other. And there is strong evidence to suggest that with the German, with the Free German League of Culture, the Austrian Center, the Aya itself, many of the members of sort of through the work that I've done at Ben-Hur, there's an entire list of Jewish artists, refugees that were affiliated with Aya, and that sort of that kind of led me to look at the Tate papers of Aya and actually meet with Andy Friend at Tate as well. So yes, there's a lot more to explore there, and I am somehow in the midst of this work, so it's not finished, and I'm quite happy to take on any sort of critical comments that the audience may have. And in reference to these question, yes, it's interesting. I think I'm still yet to explore other voices and other Jewish artistic voices from Eastern Europe that obviously they had a very different fate. A lot of the work that is produced post-liberation, it's very, very striking in the way that it's a call for action in terms of let's seek justice, and the figures of the perpetrators are very prominent in some of that work. But of course, those artists who were strongly anti-fascist, they were obviously persecuted quite very very early on, and so they tended to kind of migrate where they could really, and so that's why we see this trajectory of sort of artists in sort of being active in Prague, Paris, London, and then moving forward into sort of into New York and in the United States, and even Argentina. Karl Meffert, he had been an instrumental figure there, putting together an exile newspaper of sort of German-speaking refugees in Argentina, being very much prominently anti-fascist there in his work. Thank you.
So we have time just to take two last questions, more comments before we close. First of all, Jason, and then Monica. Jason.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
Absolutely.
Okay, I don't know if you want me to come on video or whatever. It's up to you. At the moment, I've written a book and a play on Cyprus and the DP camps, and the fact that I've called it Under the Wire. I've also written another play on Donna Gracie, but that's beyond the scope of this. Now, one of the things that fascinates me has been the George Orwellian concept that the Brits, after the Second World War, actually did actually then persecuted the actual DPs, the displaced people, after the Second World War. There were 250,000 DPs in the concentration camps that left. And I don't know if you're aware of that. And there was a lot of art that they actually did and a lot of culture within those camps and a lot of refugee sides. So even though you're looking at it, from a German, Austrian, Czech sort of perspective, a lot of those people were stuck. There were the pogroms over in Poland, meant that they were stuck in the concentration camps, and then they were stuck out into Cyprus. Are you looking at any of the artists there at all? One. So I've gone on to Yad Vashem and some of their websites. I can put a link in here as an example of some of the art that's going on, because I'm also trying to make sure that my work is authentic. So I've added a link there to the Yad Vashem side for some of the art, if that's useful for you. Just a thought. And I sort of wondered if there's have you done anything on there to actually investigate that side, in terms of on the refugee side. And the second, the second thought is that you've got other people who've saved Jews who died, like Maximilian Kolbe as well, who's a saint, who's Catholic. Now, and he saved 2,000 Jews. So have you looked at any art from that side, looking at it from different perspectives?
Thank you, Jason.
Thank you for that. Yeah.
Monica.
Diana, thanks for your talk. As you may know, I'm the founding director of the Insiders Outsiders project, and I would love to meet with you with more time to discuss all manner of things. So I'll keep it very short, and again, not a question, I think, by way of conclusion, but it's not just Andy Friend's book, which is recently published and very relevant, but there's another one which you may or may not be aware of, by Harriet Atkinson. You come across that? University of Brighton. It's called Showing Resistance, Propaganda and Modernist Exhibitions in Britain, 1933 to 1953, Manchester University Press. I can put you in touch with her if you like. She's also recently made a short film about Henrian, which has only just been released. But I think it's interesting. You say it's the untold story. It's sort of half true, as these two publications suggest. There's a lot of interest, particularly at the moment, not accidentally. But you're quite right that the Jewishness is somehow subsumed in the more general label of anti-fascist. And I think that is indeed worth taking further. So thank you.
Thank you, Monica. Diana, do you want to have a couple of last words?
Yeah, sure. Yes, thank you both for these lovely comments and questions. Yes, Monica, I'm definitely would love to be in touch and to have a look at this most recent work of Atkinson's that I haven't come across yet. So thank you for pointing that out to me. So in terms of artwork produced in the DP camps post-liberation, yes, there's fascinating collection of work of early publications put together in very limited editions by survivors themselves in various countries, where they sort of, yeah, they happen to be liberated, but also in DP camps. Most centrally, I think what I've seen is from Bergen-Belsen camp, as well as sort of the DP camp experience, and that's a whole story on its own, and the visual is very much part of it. As you know, the survivors at that time, that they were putting up together, not just a theater. KZ is a very well-known sort of theater group that they were sort of telling their story. So it's very much this burning need to tell, and a lot of it is visual and very raw and immediate. I can give you one example that I'm sort of fascinated that I will be developing, would be Simon Wiesenthal's KZ Mauthausen. It's a strongly visual testimony of his experiences, where the perpetrators are extremely prominent, and part of this work is also to kind of join the dots in terms of this sort of the image of the perpetrator as it sort of shifts from the 30s to the late 40s, and notice the sort of differences, the striking differences there. So I haven't come across directly with in touch with work produced specifically from Cyprus camps, but I'm very much interested to look at anything that is visual, produced early on, as early forms of testimony by survivors themselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Diana. I'd like to, before we close, I'd like to thank everyone who came along to this session today. Everyone who made a comment or posed a question. That's a very important part of what makes these seminars so rewarding. I'll just mention that this is our last seminar this term, but we will have a full program next term, and we begin on the 21st of January with Pavel Brunson from the University of Heidelberg, who'll be talking about Jew clubs, which will be a talk about football, Jews, and anti-Semitism today. But above all, and most important, I'd like to thank Diana for a hugely rich, informative, and an eye-opening talk, which both laid out a lot of material and also raised some extremely important questions. Thank you very much, Diana.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you to all who have been here for the session today. And I'm looking forward to keeping in touch. Thank you so much for the comments and the contributions and the questions.